continue our series of candidate profiles with Libertarian Jim Gillen. Jim is one of 3 candidates running to represent Indiana's District 7 in the Indiana State House. Incumbent David Niezgotsky is running for State Senate, leaving District 7 an open seat. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start by asking you why you decided to run this particular year.
My interest in running for public office began a few years ago when my son was born. We didn't know before he was born, but we certainly found out shortly thereafter that he had multiple chromosome abnormalities. And after spending his first 46 days in the NICU, and my wife and I getting a crash course in being his advocate, and then every day since then, because he cannot speak, being his advocate, it really instilled in me this desire to be that voice and that advocate for those who have no voice, and to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves.
Why Libertarian? We have a strong 2-party system, as you probably more than most people realize, and so why run on the Libertarian platform?
I've never really felt 100% at home with either the Republicans or the Democrats. At different points in my life, I've felt as though I identified with each of them. And then when it came to getting involved in politics, I was concerned that maybe not right away, but at some point down the line, I would be compelled to vote the party line on some issue. And anybody who knows me knows that I'm not comfortable giving up that level of autonomy. The Libertarian Party is a good split between the two, being fiscally responsible but also being more socially accepting. And so it seemed like a natural fit, and with Libertarians really being a loose coalition of independents, I don't have the concern that at some point somebody's going to pressure me to vote against my conscience or against my constituents.
Okay, so liberty then, freedom from government, is a central theme for Libertarians, and it sounds like that's what you have in mind when you talk about fiscal responsibility combined with more social acceptance?
Yes. A common theme inside of Libertarian camps, if you talk to several Libertarians, is we feel as though our government is overreaching too far currently, and we'd like to see it scaled back a little bit. And a large part of that has to do with finances. We feel as though we're being taxed to death. And I would like to see our government do more with what they have, and not overspend and not keep coming back to us for more and more taxes.
Then talking about the tax system, or thinking about the tax system, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you would like to see it reformed.
Well, the first step would be I need to get hands-on in the room with the budget in front of me and see where exactly are we allocating our resources, and sit down and find out why money is being allocated the way it is. And when I say sit down, I sit down with fellow representatives and say, okay, this is this year's budget, and these are the past year's budgets. Why are they like that? I assume that there are no programs on here that are bad programs. I assume that everything on here is a good program. But then the question becomes, is this really something that is best for us to fund at a state level? And then begin that discussion.
So as you think about that idea of budget allocation, where does the government come in something like job creation? Are there certain things, such as infrastructure, that the government just has to invest in order to help to make business growth possible? Or do you think there should be more limited government intervention than there is now?
Yes, to both.
All right.
Certainly if our roads and railways and other transit systems, flight, aren't conducive to getting goods in or goods out, then that makes it very difficult for any sort of manufacturing. Obviously, if our tax system is so burdensome that it makes it very difficult for business, that's a deterrent. We all have a vested interest in having good, healthy roads. We all have a vested interest in good, healthy transit systems. But I also think that another compulsion to try and bring business back in is to alleviate some of the existing tax burdens.
Now, in terms of paying for those roads, if we all have a commitment to them, would this be a case where adjusting the fuel tax that hasn't been adjusted in many, many years would be an option that you would consider? Should we dip into the surplus? Or what would be your proposal? Because we seem to have just a short-term fix right now.
We do have a short-term fix, and the short-term fix is another in a long string of short-sightedness. The reality of it is, and I haven't heard anybody say this, so I'm going to say it, shame on not just our sitting legislators, but the ones before them. When we put in roads, we know that those roads eventually are going to need paved, repaved, and maybe even replaced, expanded. But did we budget for that? Have we set the money aside all those years and said, okay, we expect this road to last us X number of years, so we are going to set aside this amount of money for each year for those number of years so that when it comes time to replace them, it's not a crisis and, oh my God, where are we going to get the money? And that's what we're dealing with right now. Decades of fiscal irresponsibility, not planning for and just saying, that'll be that legislator's problem when they get into office. And guess what? Now we have that. Now it's a crisis. Now it's like, oh my God, where are we going to get all of this money? And sure, lots of things are on the table right now, but one thing that's not on the table for me is raising taxes.
What about earmarking the current taxes to the roads so that it has to be spent there?
Again, I'd have to...
The fuel taxes.
I'd have to sit down and see exactly what other programs are on there. It sounds great in theory, but until I have the opportunity to sit down and really analyze with other representatives and critically, evaluate, I can't commit to an answer, but I can certainly say that's perfectly viable. I have no problem with that because that's utilizing existing funds.
Now, speaking of funds, one of the biggest expenses always in the state legislative budget is the area of education. And I wonder if you think that we are spending our dollars correctly or wisely, what your thoughts are on school choice scholarships, sometimes called vouchers, and the whole budgeting scenario that we find ourselves in where we are paying for public schools, charter schools, private schools, and some online schools in what people seem to think is not enough money, even though there was recently an increase in the dollars.
Man, if you hit on anything I could talk on for forever, you just hit on it. So, as I think you know, I'm the son of a school teacher, and I grew up and married a school teacher. So I've had my entire life the school teacher's perspective in my ear about educational matters. I am not a fan of giving public funds to private entities, period. That's not to say there aren't situations where maybe it's appropriate, but I feel as though we've become entirely too loosey-goosey with it. It seems completely inappropriate to me to give public funds, public education funds, to private schools, be them charter schools, parochial schools, home schools, whatever you want to call the private school. If it's private, then let it be private. It also seems completely unfair to me that private schools do not have to meet the same standards as public schools. So they can get public funds, but they don't have to meet the public standards that the public schools do. You talk about having the best of both worlds if you're the private and the worst of both worlds if you're the public. It's completely unfair, and it needs some serious attention, and it needs somebody like me to challenge the way it's currently set up and to bring it to light and to get people talking about it at least.
Now, another issue, big issue with the education system is the whole issue of testing, and we seem to be moving away from ISTEP, but it's not clear what will replace it. How should we try to evaluate school performance and hold schools accountable?
That's another difficult one because we're trying to treat people as though they're a product. And imagine how confusing it has to be for a child to constantly be told, you're an individual, you're unique, you focus on what makes you special. But we need you to pass the standard test that everybody else passes, and you need to be just like them, and you need to dress like them, and you need to talk like them, and you can only do the things that they do. I mean, that is a terrible conflict. In my years going through education and since graduating and seeing it through the eyes of my mother while she was still teaching and the eyes of my wife who is still teaching, I see standardized education just ripping the personality out of children and out of education. I see the arts and humanities suffering, and it pains me because it's the arts and humanities that make us who we are, that make us human. How do you measure that? I don't know. How do you measure normal? How do you measure anybody's worth? At some point it comes down to you have to trust the people you have in the position for the job. Now, either we trust that how we educate and train our teachers and how we educate and train our administrators is appropriate and good, or it's not. If it is good, then what further measure do you really need? The children are going, if you have good quality educators and good quality administrators wherever they go to serve, they're going to elevate the level of the experience for all the children. And I don't see why you have to try and pigeonhole children and try and turn them into cogs in a system. They're individuals, they're not product.
So it sounds like you're not a big fan of the 8th ref rating system of schools.
I'm not a big fan of it for multiple reasons. Number one, I don't know of any other government agency in the state that has such a rating, so it seems as though educators are being singled out. Number two, I can tell you from having observed it on the inside for the last several years, they fudge the numbers. You know, teachers, administrators, as well as the reviewers are constantly fudging the numbers. It's not a set in stone scale. There's a lot of discretion, personal discretion that goes into it. So it's not fair. It is biased, and personal relationships and politicking certainly comes into play.
Now, one of the other issues that the state has been talking about is whether or not we should expand pre-K education. Should universal state-funded pre-K be expanded in your view, or should we stick with the pilot?
Pilot, are you talking...
where we just only have
a
small number of students now who are having funding to choose preschools.
This kind of started back in the 60s with President Johnson and Head Start, and it was designed for lower income pre-K students to get them in, but really it was more so designed to get their families into the system to start providing social services to the families. And I see this going that very same direction. It's a fine line because I have to be very clear in understanding why we're trying to get families into the system. If we're trying to get them into the system to help them, that's fine, assuming that they are eligible to receive help, meaning they are legal citizens who have at some point in time or are capable of paying into the system, then that's fine. If they need help, give them a helping hand. But if we're trying to get families into the system to try and violate their Fourth Amendment rights and learn more about how they live their lives and control what they do in their house, I'm not okay with that.
Speaking of controlling what people do, we had one of the most controversial abortion laws in the nation pass the legislature last year to say that it's illegal to provide an abortion in case of fetal defect. And so that's one of the things that I want to ask you about.
Man,
did we go too far?
You did your research on me, because you know the buttons to hit. My wife and I, 4 years ago, had a beautiful baby boy born, and we didn't know when we were pregnant with him, but we did find out within hours after his birth that he had something very, very wrong with him. And in the course of the next 46 days, through being in the NICU at Memorial and at Riley, we found out he has multiple chromosome abnormalities. And he has severe hypotonia, severe atrophy of the corpus callosum, which is to say he's basically two-brained, so he can't do anything that's a process. So he can't talk, he can't sit, he can't stand, he never will. And I would never have wished this on my worst enemy. Absolutely not. And so to tell a parent ahead of time that they know that they are carrying a child that is going to have these awful abnormalities, that they can't save themselves and their child from that future, that seems wrong to me.
Okay, and we will continue our conversation on the web because that's all the time we have right now. So check us out on the website. Welcome to our continued conversation with District 7 candidate Jim Gillen. Jim, thanks for sticking around for our web portion of the interview.
Thanks for keeping me around.
Now, before the break, we were talking about a really difficult issue, which is the issue of the new abortion bill that makes it illegal for a couple to decide to have an abortion, or at least for a doctor to perform that abortion in the case of a known fetal abnormality. And you mentioned your son, who I know you're a fierce advocate for your son.
Absolutely.
Love him very much. But at the end, you said that nobody should be forced, if they know ahead of time, into a decision of becoming a caregiver for somebody who needs that kind of lifetime care, that you felt that it should be their decision rather than the government's.
Absolutely. It's I can tell you that 5 years ago, had somebody said there's something wrong with your developing baby, my wife and I both would have said, that's okay. We're going to keep the baby. We're going to move forward with this. And I can tell you now, 4.5 years into his life, that we love him dearly. And he has changed our lives irreversibly and brought great joy into our lives. But it's very challenging. It is very difficult. And I cannot sit here and tell you that 5 years ago, knowing what I know now, I would have made the same decision. In fact, matter, I can tell you straight up, my wife and I have talked about having another child, and we both are in absolute agreement. If there is anything wrong with that child, we're aborting, because we couldn't do this again, and I wouldn't wish this on even my worst enemy. It is heartbreaking. I can't think of anything much worse that can happen to a parent.
And having another child with those significant needs, it sounds like would compromise your care of your current son.
We struggle day to day to make it with our one neurotypical, beautiful daughter, 8 years old, and then our beautiful neuroatypical 4-year-old son. There's absolutely no way. The financial burden, the emotional burden, the time burden, there's no way. There's absolutely no way. And anybody who doesn't understand that has lived a very privileged life, and as part of their nightly prayers should be thanking God.
Now, let's move on to another controversial issue, which was the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It got a lot of attention, and certainly many legislators thought it got too much attention because they preferred to focus on some of the economic issues and education reform. So what is your view on that particular piece of legislation? Certainly you think First Amendment rights are important. Sure. Was RFRA needed?
The way I answered this in the debate And the way I'll answer it again is, quite frankly, our Constitution, this should be a federal issue, and our Constitution was created with a fundamental flaw wherein which it classified a certain subsect of the population as worth only 3/5 of a person. It then rectified that with the 14th Amendment, but women were still treated as subclass, and it tried to rectify that then with the 19th Amendment, but nowhere in our Constitution does it say a person's a person no matter how small. And quite frankly, I think if we just added another constitutional amendment that simply said all persons being of the human race are afforded equal protection and process under the law, I think that would solve not only this, but a ton of other problems. Do I think it's fair to try and force a group to accept as a member somebody that would bring disharmony into that group? Absolutely not. But then I also have to ask the individual, why do you want to be a member of that group? Case in point, we have fraternities. Does it make sense for a woman to want to join a fraternity? There are sororities. You dig? We have all different types of religious denominations. So why do you want to be of this particular denomination as opposed to another denomination that maybe fits more closely with the way you live your life and the things you believe? That said, it is absolutely wrong to discriminate against any individual for anything other than the content of their character.
So in terms of public accommodations or firing, hiring decisions, housing decisions, in those cases, given that we don't have federal protection for LGBT community, is that something that you think should be put in the state constitution or in state law?
Since we don't have a federal amendment, I would like to see, and if given the opportunity, I would propose that we add to our state constitution an amendment that simply says all persons being of the human race are afforded equal protection and process under the law. And that would cover that.
Now, in the meantime, should local governments, if the state does not use that wording or some other wording, be allowed to pass their own ordinances that provide more protections than the state?
The way our government is set up, particularly citing the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, that right is designated to the local governments. They have that. They absolutely have a right. If there is not a law at the state level or at the federal level prohibiting them from making such an ordinance or such a law, they have that right.
One of the things that all state legislators seem very keen on talking about and trying to achieve is bringing high-paid jobs to their district and to the state. Absolutely. And so how is it that you would try to do this? Is it about cutting regulations, increasing wages? Would you support an increased state minimum wage? I think I know the answer to that, but why don't you tell our viewers?
I'm not a fan of minimum wage, of government-enforced minimum wage, mainly because I think it's a shell game. It's a ruse. It doesn't really work. In fact, matters. I could work out on paper how it does more harm than good, given that employees are the single largest expense for any employer. So to raise their salary raises the cost to produce goods exponentially or to provide service exponentially, which means those costs have to go up, and they tend to go up not in proportion to the increase in minimum wage. Also, it causes lower-end jobs that were great entry-level jobs for younger or less experienced people to get their foot in the door and gain experience. Those jobs go away. And so I'm not a huge fan of government-imposed minimum wage. I think there is just a natural minimum wage. And I went through this exercise with somebody who was arguing against me. And I said, okay, middle of winter, it's cruddy out. Would you deliver papers for $15 an hour? Absolutely. Would you do it for $10 an hour? Would you do it for $5 an hour? No. Okay, so we found that your minimum wage, your personal minimum wage, is somewhere between $5 and $10 an hour. Well, but that's the answer. We all have a minimum wage under which we're not going to work, no matter what the job is.
Well, what if you have a state program that requires you to work in order to get any kind of public assistance? And you need that public assistance to survive.
What about
So kind of right to work, or rather a welfare to work type of program. So you might have a certain minimum, but if you have no food on your table at all, might you take something that is less than you can live on simply because you're required to do so?
Well, technically you have to anyway, because in all of those situations we have wage limits that if you exceed by even a penny, the service that was being offered to you is cut off from you. So, in a way, that scenario already exists.
People taking low-wage jobs and then the state paying for
Sure.
additional assistance?
Sure. Yes.
Rather than setting a minimum wage, do you think that's preferable?
No. I'm not saying that's preferable. I'm saying that that's already happening. I think that this entire system could use a set of fresh eyes to go over it and to look it over and to make some suggestions as to how we could make it more applicable in the real world. I think that it looked good on paper, it was great in theory, but what I've seen of its application here in the real world, I find it lacking.
So when you say it, do you mean minimum wage law and
minimum
where
wage,
it's set?
I mean minimum wage law, I also mean subsidies. Because it seems as though the way the system is currently set up, it seems as though they want you to make a little bit, but not a lot. And so they encourage you to take low jobs in order to get subsidies. And if you make too much, well, then the subsidies go bye-bye. And the limits are really rather low. I don't know how anybody can survive just on those subsidies and the low-paying job alone. It just doesn't. It seems like the current application is flawed.
Okay, so something you definitely want to take a
It is something I would
at.
something I would love to take a look at and help work on and help make better. I'd like to make a system that actually works for people.
Another big expense for many people, and also something that affects quality of life, is access to health care.
Yes.
And in this state, we have a Healthy Indiana plan. There's a lot of controversy nationally about Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and so the HIP plan sort of is a variation maybe on the theme. How do you think we should move forward in terms of making sure that Hoosiers have access to health care?
I've said before that if you've met one libertarian, you've met one libertarian. And that's because you dig deep enough on issues and you're going to find that we're mostly just a loose coalition of independents. You're not going to find very many libertarians who are going to say what I'm about to say when it comes to health care. But it doesn't take a lassie to figure out that it is in the government's best interest to have a healthy populace, because a healthy populace is a work-ready populace, and a work-ready populace is a productive and a revenue-generating taxable populace. So there is definitely there's definitely a role for government in health care. That said, the way we currently have it structured is not government health care. What it is forced privatized monopoly, saying that, oh, you have to buy private insurance, but you can only buy it from these handful of carriers. That's not government insurance, that's government insured monopoly. And that's a big problem. So no wonder prices have skyrocketed. You know, if you cut out all the competition and just funnel all the business to a handful of companies, which if you dig even deeper, you probably will find out that they're probably all the same company, that's a flawed system.
So you think actually going to a statewide or nationwide plan, more of a universal health insurance, would be preferable to these private monopolies?
I think it'd absolutely be preferable to what we currently have with these private monopolies. That said, would I still vote for it? That I don't know yet, because I'd have to see how it would play out, and I would like the opportunity to sit down with 149 other very intelligent people at the State House and have this discussion. Because, quite frankly, what we had before was a lot better than what we have now. And we know what we had before was flawed.
One of the things that you mentioned was trying to make sure that every member of the society can be a productive member of society, sure. A productive tax-paying member, which is a little interesting to hear a libertarian phrase it quite that way. But one of the things that we have, not just in Indiana, but nationwide, is a lot of people who are incarcerated, and often for nonviolent drug offenses. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and what direction you'd like to move there, if you think that more people should move out of the prison system and into productive lives as private citizens.
Absolutely. I have a problem with incarcerating somebody who hasn't actually committed a crime against somebody else. Does that make sense? And a lot of our drug, to pick on them because you brought them up, a lot of our incarcerated on drug charges are there because they were charged and convicted of possession. They weren't hurting anybody. To me, it doesn't add to the severity or take away from the severity of a crime, somebody's state of impairment or sobriety. I don't care if they're drunk, if they're sober, if they're high. A crime is a crime, which is to say, if somebody robs you, that's a crime. And it doesn't make it better or worse that they were drunk, sober, or high. If somebody rapes you, it doesn't make it better or worse if they were drunk, sober, or high. If somebody assaults you, it doesn't make it better or worse if you're drunk, sober, or high.
So you'd like to focus punish the crimes.
Punish the crime.
And the other as a treatment issue.
It's a public
health issue.
It's a public health issue.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I'm sure you'll be talking with many more people before November 8th.
Thank you very much.